solo exhibition that I've had post-graduation, so it's a really big deal for me. And I'd also really like to say thank you to the faculty and staff here at the Kilgore College Art Department, and especially to Coy, because he was the one that asked me to come and do this exhibition and kind of help to organize everything. And she's going to hate me for this, but I'm also going to give a shout out to my friend Haley, who helped me to transport and install all of these pieces. Like I literally could not have gotten this done without you. So thank you so much for everyone that's helped me kind of put this together. So I'm going to take the next few minutes to talk about not only the pieces that you see here, but also some of my experiences as an artist as a whole, and how those experiences have led to the creation of this body of work. And the first thing that I want to call attention to is the title of the exhibition, which is Make Room. And I realize that on the surface, there doesn't seem to be much of an obvious connection between that phrase and the pieces themselves, which I will talk about at length in just a minute. But first, I want to discuss some of the broader themes of the work, just to give you all a little more context as to what exactly is going on here. So the most important theme in my work is this idea that what we think of as identity or sense of self is not a fixed object, but something more like a mosaic, where the overall bigger picture is kind of made up of these smaller little bits and pieces. So I'm very interested in how the physical world is kind of translated into a person's experience and how it interacts with the history and the belief systems of that person. And then it subsequently becomes something new, something that is now part of the tapestry that makes up that individual's larger sense of identity. One thing you might notice when viewing these pieces is that it can be a little difficult to tell what exactly it is you're looking at. A lot of people seem to interpret them as landscapes, especially in the case of most of these larger oil paintings, or sometimes living creatures in the case of some of the smaller, irregularly shaped collages that you can see down on that end of the hall and down here. But nothing is ever obvious or clear-cut, and that is, by design. These pieces do take inspiration from a variety of recognizable imagery. We have landscapes, obviously, and fabric forms, and bits of the human body, and even architectural elements in a couple of places. But these images are really more subtext than anything. They're kind of on my mind during the creation process, and they show up in the reference material that I use for these pieces. But by the time the composition has been finalized, they've usually been so heavily abstracted that they're basically unrecognizable. And that's because these pieces are not about individual experiences, but about the overall process by which a person interacts with the physical world. Kind of in the same way that, the details of a particular experience or a particular location might fade over time, but a general impression will remain in a person's memory. So I'm very interested in how these impressions of our past experiences, help to shape us and make us the people that we are. And I'm very much of the opinion that this process of experience and integration is never ending. I firmly believe that everyone is in a state of change for the entirety of the time that they're alive, and that it's just kind of inescapable. It's kind of cool to think about, and it's also a little bit terrifying to think that you're not quite the same person from day to day, because you're always adding new things into your mental inventory. So having all of that context out of the way, I want to circle back around to this idea of the title and talk about what it means in relation to these pieces. The thing is, I graduated from UT Tyler from my master's program about a year ago, so last December. And for months leading up to graduation, I kept hearing this idea repeated from professors and other artists that I knew that it will be so much more difficult to keep up with your artistic practice once you're out of school, and that you just need to be prepared for that, as an inevitability, that life will eventually get in the way. And to be fully transparent here, I'm kind of speaking from a place of privilege in the sense that I'm very lucky with my time. I don't have kids to worry about, and my other jobs are pretty flexible. But even still, yeah, it's a lot harder to keep up with nowadays. It's not, locked into my schedule like it used to be. Now I'm having to work around things like teaching and, other life obligations. I used to have, a designated studio space up at the school that I could go escape to when I wanted to work. Now my studio space is my living room floor in my little 400 square foot apartments. And about half of these pieces that you're seeing here are from my graduate exhibition from last year, because I just didn't have time to make an entirely new body of work as much as I would have loved to. So for months after graduation, and even now to an extent, I felt like I was constantly like mentally rearranging things, thinking things like, okay, maybe if I can get done with my lecture prep early enough tonight, I can squeeze in like half an hour of working on my art. Or like coming back by my apartment for 5 minutes in between jobs so I could just take another look at a piece that I've been thinking about all morning. And the more I thought about what my creative process had become, the more I realized how relevant it was to the overall theme of the pieces. Again, this idea of constantly being in a state of change and having to make room for new experiences and new priorities and obligations. The thing is, my work didn't reach any kind of a peak when I graduated, or at least I hope it didn't, because in my opinion, that's kind of the same thing as, stagnating. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that what my creative practice had become was part of the pieces, and that these pieces can only exist in the way they do now because I was having to respond to a change in circumstances. If we look at some of these smaller, like framed pieces here, for instance, we have these little like picture within a picture images that were actually watercolor paintings that I made as a grad student. And those only came about because, during lockdowns, we couldn't access our studio spaces, and so I had to switch to making smaller work during COVID. So again, it's like these pieces cannot exist in the way they do unless I am having to respond to some kind of life circumstance changing. I also find that, whenever you're working towards some kind of big goal, whether it's graduating or finding a job or getting married or whatever it is, it's like it can be really difficult to see past that end, and then you accomplish whatever it is you set out to do and nothing actually ends, and life just kind of keeps going until one day you find yourself thinking, well, what am I supposed to do now? I spent all this time and energy on this one thing, and now it's over, and I just have to keep living. And yeah, that's kind of a scary place to be in, to feel kind of lost like that. But I think it's also a really great opportunity to kind of stop and think about whatever it was that got you there in the first place, and what kind of experiences have led you to being the person that you are and creating the things that you do. And I think it's also a great time to kind of stop and take a deep breath and just think about and prepare and make room for whatever it is that comes next. So again, thank you all for coming out. I really do appreciate all the support, and I can also take questions if anyone happens to have any.
I do. Tell me, do you name the piece before you start work on it or afterwards?
Afterwards, almost exclusively, yeah. So usually what happens is I make the piece, and I have all these different things in my mind, different pieces of memories, and like things that the different images remind me of. But it's not until the piece kind of comes together and I can see the whole composition that I really start to think about, okay, I really connect this to a particular experience that I have or a particular memory from my past, and that's where a lot of those titles come from. And the titles are something I really didn't address too much in my talk, so I guess I'll kind of mention them here. Essentially, the titles are all meant to be like common experiences that everyone has, or most people have on some level. So my goal for those is, for a person to walk up to the little title card and to read the title and kind of think, okay, I've had something similar happen to me, and then let that memory kind of reframe their understanding of the piece, where they start to kind of understand the piece through the lens of whatever it is that they're remembering. So, yeah. Oh, everyone back there.
Could you tell us like your process from start to end, like how do you pick up the composition, like how do you even form these shapes, and like what goes on in your mind while making this process? Like, could you go into depth with that?
Yeah, I can do that. So I want to start by saying first off that there's a lot of different mediums and materials here, so they all have a slightly different process. But I guess we'll kind of start by talking about the oil paintings. So usually what I do with the oil paintings is I start by making fabric collages. So I'll take things like I've used like my own clothes, and I've used like bits and pieces of like scrap fabric that I've had. I've used like towels from my parents' house and like fold them and make these compositions out of them and photograph them, and then transfer them onto a digital art program and kind of like draw back on top of them. I'll usually add in like parts of the human body and like maybe landscape landscape elements, as you can see in a lot of these, and then that digital composition that I have becomes the basis for the painting. But it really is just a basis. I started off, when I started doing these, kind of making them a one-for-one transfer, but the further I got into the process, I kind of started letting myself have a little bit of like wiggle room when I was working on these compositions, where I'm looking at, you know, the basic layout of the composition that I have in the digital design. But once I get that on the canvas, I kind of put the reference image away and just let the painting be whatever it wants to be. And so things will change along that process. The collages are a little more difficult to talk about. They also kind of started as like taking the compositions I had made in the oil paintings and then using those as inspiration for the paper collages. So there's this kind of like step-by-step where you have the physical fabric collage, the photo, the painting, and then the collage. So there, it's almost like a game of telephone, you know, where like some bits of information are carrying over and other ones aren't. But I kind of abandoned that in the past year or so, and I've really just kind of started focusing more on the materials themselves. And these paper collages, I mean, well, obviously they're mostly made of paper, but they're like scrap paper that I get from anywhere I can find. Some of it is bought, but a lot of it is like, at the end of the semesters, I'll go up to like the printmaking lab at UT and just ask, hey, anyone have any prints that they don't want, that they want to give to me? And I'll use those as like source material, essentially, and use those and paint back on top of those as well. So it's kind of this like gathering of information almost. So with the collages, there's really more emphasis on the materials themselves. I'm just kind of cutting them up and like rearranging them and gluing them together and ripping them apart again until I finally get something that's interesting to me and then building on top of it. So that's kind of how that works. Oh, and there is, and you can't really see it down here, but there are a couple of pieces down on the end there. These kind of irregularly shaped collages that are floating in the frame. So if you go look at those, you'll see that they have kind of a halo behind them a little bit. And that's because on those, what I've done is like made the collage and then mounted them on mat board and then mounted that onto a really thick piece of foam core. So there's a little bit of a space between the piece and like the back of the frame, and then spray painted it with this like obnoxiously bright pink spray paint, so it almost looks like it's backlit a little bit. So that's another kind of step that I try to take with some of the collages to get like that little extra bit of something to kind of finish off the process. But thank you for that. That kind of gave me the opportunity to elaborate on a bunch of things.
Your colors, when you first have your concept of what you want, do you already know your colors, or does that come as
I'm working on it?
As you're working on it?
That's another one that kind of depends on the piece. Most of the time, no, I don't have like a set color palette that I'm working with. For the oil paintings where I have the digital design, you know, I have that to kind of fall back on if I feel like the color palette's kind of gotten out of whack. But there have been a bunch of them, especially with the collages where I made them and thought, oh my god, this is not working in here. And then I have to go and remove a lot of pieces and then put some back in until I find something. So like with everything else about the pieces, it's really more about like the process and the exploration, and usually the color palette kind of emerges from that. But color is very important to me, as you can tell. And that like, again, that like bright fluorescent pink shows up a lot.
Just the materials question. What are you using as an adhesive? Like glazing medium or some kind of certain glue? Or
Oh, so for the collages, I literally just Mod Podge for that for most of the time. So I believe it is archival. But then also coming back with like the canvas ones there and clear coating them so they're a little bit more protected. Those pieces are also a little bit out of my comfort zone on those two walls right there, because I'm used to having collages that are framed in a much more traditional way, but those are mounted on canvases and they're kind of exposed, you know, because they don't have that like plexiglass on them. So I had to come up with a way to kind of protect the surface of it a little bit. So I clear coated most of those on that, and that kind of helps them stay together.
How much time do you spend on your digital before it translates into the actual medium?
Not long, actually. Usually the digital pieces are done within just a couple hours, because they are really meant to just be, you know, basic layouts that I can draw upon. most of the time, I don't think of them as finished pieces in and of themselves. They're more like a step in the process. So I usually get done with those pretty quickly so that I can hurry up and get working on the canvas, because that takes much, much longer.
I have one more question. Do you have any advice for young artists who want to pursue an exhibition or create works that are in a museum like this, or not a museum, an art exhibition? And what would you say to them?
Like advice for getting into an exhibition, or like making the work itself, or both?
Both advice.
Okay, so as far as like making work itself, this is something I struggle with like with my own students. Honestly, my biggest piece of advice is just to experiment with like as much as possible. I went into like UT Tyler's art program sure that I was going to create representational, realistic work, and now, you know, look where it's come to. So yeah, just like trying out as many different materials and styles and processes as you can until you find something that really clicks with you. And also don't be afraid to like kind of dip your fingers in multiple pies, if that makes sense. Don't feel like you have to like nail yourself down with one particular medium. Like I was doing just painting for a little while, which I love, but it kind of felt like something was missing from the process. And so when I started experimenting with collage, I felt like my process was overall more well-rounded, and then those paintings and those collage pieces were kind of playing off of each other and bringing out like aspects of the work that weren't there before, if that makes sense. As far as getting into gallery exhibitions, I mean, a lot of that is kind of a combination of putting yourself out there, making connections, and then also, you know, just being in the right place and the right time. Coy, like I said, back in, I think, May, messaged me out of the blue and asked if I wanted to do a solo show here. And I was like, yeah, absolutely. I'm not going to say no to that. So you'll have those kinds of things that will happen, you know, once you kind of get your name out there a little bit. But a lot of it also is just like going and applying to shows. I mean, there are several like websites that I'll use where I'll go and, you know, send in a piece, and you know, it's just one piece. It's not a full exhibition, but you have one piece in a juried show, and that's aligned on a resume, and it's more eyes on your pieces. And then also, you know, things like having a social media presence and all of those little like odds and ends that just come with being a visual artist. So just really getting yourself out there as much as possible, and attending other events too, and talking to other artists. I know like some of my students and some of like the BFA students that I've worked with over at UT or that I've talked to will sometimes get together and just by themselves like put together a show, and they'll contact a gallery space or they'll do like a little pop-up exhibition. So they're not having anyone necessarily invite them in. They're just like, we want to do this, and we're going to find a place to put it, and hopefully people will come and look at it. So, you know, putting together things like that, I think also just helps you kind of get out there. So I hope that is helpful. I know there was a lot of information all together.